Hello everyone, today we talk about Arretinian warfare in the first half of the 14th century. I've been making lots of these strategy and campaigns episodes recently also because I've started making them much better, especially starting from this one that is also in fact a first a video that I've ever made on specifically the military history of a single Italian commune. We talked about the Italian communes one by one at a time, also with sort of entire series sometimes dedicated to the more important ones for the historical regional series that in the case of central and northern Italy, mostly regardless of sort of the vast expanse of the entire medieval millennium, passes through individual cities, right? I'm also one, actually possibly the only person on YouTube to discuss proper Italian communal warfare, late communal warfare, and I have the means to basically cover in depth, as we will see now, every single commune's military history. And I'm pretty sort of certain about the fact that nobody even ever publishes anything about it in academia. So this content is truly unique. Today we talk about Arezzo, that is essentially an Apenninic commune of eastern Tuscany. We talked about Tuscan history, but most of the times our attention was sucked by Florence, that alone obviously represents a very important pinnacle in Western civilization. It influenced a great deal of what we think of like modern Europe eventually became. So Florentine history is very important. In fact, the series I was referring to before about the Italian communes, mostly at least the largest one, was properly about Florence, right? We talked about Pisa, as a matter of fact, we talked about Siena, but there are many other communes in Tuscany, such as Lucca, Prato, and Arezzo, as a matter of fact. Among the sort of bigger ones, then there are some smaller ones that are mostly famous also for touristic reasons, because paradoxically, they preserve themselves better, right? Think about San Gimignano's towers, right? Skyline, that is practically the closest that we have to how the Italian communes actually looked like back at the peak of communal civilization, and in many ways also the one of European civilization at this point. We talk about especially the great Guelph, Angevin, Papal, Neapolitan axis. Today we study instead a most fervently Ghibelline commune, right? Ghibelline communes were at some point the same Pisa, the same Siena. Made a video about the Battle of Montaperti, as a matter of fact. And some of you will say, well, probably many of you haven't ever heard about Arezzo as such, but some of you will ask why the first half of the 14th century in particular. Well, I could say, well, because on Schwerpunkt we will come to cover literally everything in detail at some point, life allowing, and here we are after several of sort of this instantiation of historical delivery and disclosure, so to say. However, the first half of the 14th century is an incredibly important time. As you know, in Schwerpunkt, I actually specialize in this time, and so that's partly the reason. But it's also not uniquely for that reason. On the contrary, as I was just saying, we're looking at the age of maximum expansion of European powers. And when it comes to the Italian peninsula, of course, the communes represent one of the most striking examples, if not actually the greatest one, of military activity in medieval Europe. This has been pointed out by Contamine, Mervigueur. In other words, the Italians made war more than any other people around, as far as we understand, possibly across the entirety of Eurasia. And especially the first decades of the 14th century are incredibly intense, bloody, and properly characterized by the affirmation of city-states over one another, right, paving the way to, in fact, the winners' regional states, that in this case will be Florence. So, bit of a spoiler, it doesn't end well for Arezzo. Whose military history, however, is very respectable for a number of reasons. First of all, in a video like this, we can just look at the capacity of even a sort of medium size, if not tending towards a smaller communes, to maintain a pretty staunch Ghibelline faith and acting as a point of, probably as a cornerstone of the Ghibelline network across a pretty wide area, stretching, as we will see now, from sort of eastern southern Tuscany to the Marches to Romagna, and linking up with the routine imperial expeditions that will ignite the peninsula further during this point. More in particular, some of you will say, but Schwerpunkt, you have the Battle of Campaldino 1289, where the Aretinians basically, yes, they got defeated, but also probably displayed the highest moral strength in the entire Italian communal warfare, especially, say, in this later era. They took the field against an overwhelmingly larger force, which was definitely not the case for most engagements, defying a bit sort of strategic practice, and talk about it, right? It's also the famous battle where Dante reputedly participated from the Florentine side. As we will see now, Dante will actually go in exile and also in Arezzo, and would fight together with other Florentine exiles alongside the local Ghibellines and other white Guelphs. You'll understand now better who they were, but I think you know the story. And the Battle of Campaldino is very interesting, but I would like really to make a video on it at some point. There is the Times Meaning series, but I think that not just a primary sources reconstruction, but even a much more in-depth study of the sources for Campaldino can be successfully carried out, because it's one of those battles that everybody studied, but nobody really reconstructed in a single way. So that's where Schwerpunkt comes into place. However, that same incredible bravery of the Aretinians in that specific battle, and regardless of or even more because of the defeat, is actually sort of supported, sort of continued by the rest of their history here, which is actually one of relatively steady decline in favor of Florence. And that, however, shows the pugnacious nature of these people, right? That never quite gets sort of drastically humiliated in ways that at least weren't connected to some overwhelming odds once again, and always took up a fight, like stood their ground where it was necessary. Like there could be some anthropological consideration on this area, also culturally, because essentially the Ghibelline world here, not always. Look at Pisa, was in many ways like the opposite of Arezzo in strictly Tuscan terms. Maritime Republic, big center, very sort of developed statally, civilly. They maintain a core, even Roman identity connected properly to the Holy Roman Imperial Ghibelline faith. And the Aretinians are more rustic, they're more primitive, they're more Apenninic, they're more continental. And they seem to have maintained traditions that were in staunch oppositions not just to the Guelphs, such as the Florentines, that they considered effeminated. For example, before the Battle of Campaldino, where they actually were, the Aretinians attacked, right, just to prove that superiority and almost destroyed the much larger Florentine army. And that instead, in fact, wore apparently beards and had hairs sort of put behind their head. It's as if there was a Lombard fashion against the French, and therefore kind of Frankish one, that had poured into Florence because of the Angevin political hegemony over the Italian peninsula at this point. In fact, we jump straight in by sort of chronological standards here. We can resume a little bit something in the beginning regarding the entire picture, but in a moment, this is 10 years before the expedition of Henry VII in Italy, in which, and I made videos about this, the Angevins had probably hegemonized the Italian peninsula with very non-coercive means, telling the truth. Some will become so, including Dante's exile, and we've seen this in a series about Florence, and also in the recent video I made about Charles of Valois, as a matter of fact. And that, however, kept really only pockets of Ghibelline power that at some point really found themselves in trouble, right? Because even by the time of Campaldino, things were not so neatly outlined in terms of alliances, axes, sides, etc., the international level that exists today. In 1289, yes, the Angevin hegemony was overall there, but Arezzo was still a competitive commune against Florence. 11 years later, things had really changed. The Aretinians had suffered a massive bloodbath that even for the relatively sort of minute demographic capacities of the commune, especially against Florence, is something you want to take into consideration. It's also obviously a history of seigneurial affirmation. The Tarlati of Pietramala are these bishops, counts, very much in line also with a sort of imperial legacies. We'll see now they will bond particularly with Henry VII, etc., receiving reinforcements from Germany, back in the previous years from Rudolf of Habsburg, and disliking the fact that he had sent some Lorrainese French speakers that were dismissed because at this time, already if you spoke French, you were understood to be sort of Guelph, and they didn't like it anyway, even if the king of the Romans from Germany had sent them. And so it's a very fascinating topic. As we will see now, there are also very, very interesting iconographic sources for showing you literally what Aretinian soldiers looked like. Some of them I inserted from the sort of diorama of the Battle of Campel, the different ones that exist in Italian museums, and also the cenotaph of Guido Tarlati of Pietramala, that was one of the greatest Ghibelline commanders of the era, and had made, in fact, Arezzo its not just fortress, but also the center of a pretty wide domination for considering Aretinian standards. So a pretty warlike commune that is really worth studying. We can talk about the sources later if you're interested, because there are some diplomatic collections, etc., obviously, but it's mostly, there are the Aretinian annals, minor and major, that are the main source of it. Then, of course, there is Villani, there is all the entire sort of Florentinian historiographical production. It talks a lot about Arezzo. Otherwise, it's a community you can easily follow the history of if you have the time and patience, of course, of getting into that series, into those sources, or mostly in Latin, telling the truth, not much even Villani in vernacular, but overall from Arezzo proper, just the analysis. So the military history of Arezzo between 1300 and 1350 was dominated by its persistent alignment with the Ghibelline cause, right? The pro-imperial faction in the long-standing Italian conflict between supporters of the Holy Roman Emperor and those of the Pope in a Tuscany torn by the struggle, in fact, between these groups and interests, right? As always, it's never only about that, it's also about local matters. If you study, the time of the Longobard Kingdom, you have this there's a very famous dispute that is beautifully documented by the Longobard administration, by royal investigators and judges that tells you, by the way, in the 8th century, how radically advanced and sort of civilized, literate, etc. these groups were the diocese of Arezzo and the one of Siena were at each other's throats because of some lands in between. That is just so much communal struggle, half of a millennium later. It's as if nothing had really changed. Just for telling you how old, even properly, again, the idea of the city, of the civitas, right? That is something very different from essentially most of Europe. Obviously, post-Roman one, but not even just that, right? The Italians are radically anchored and based on this massive cornerstone of the diocese, of the comitatus, and that's where not just the cities, of course, remain straight from antiquity, well alive, but also developed their own communes and city-states at this point. Now, Arezzo functioned as one of the principal strongholds of the imperial party in central Italy, right? That is properly an area of its own, historically. Naturally, it's variegated, but here it's mostly like the Tuscan world that was the most advanced, together with the Lombard one in Italy. They were substantially different, repeatedly opposing Florence and its allies while supporting the exiled White Florentines. So the moderate Bianchi, Guelph faction exiled after internal divisions in St. Florence, imperial Vicars, and signori such as the Tarlati da Pietramala that were hinted at before. This role placed Arezzo at the center of recurrent campaigns, sieges, raids, and shifting alliances that defined the region's instability throughout the first half of the 14th century as the commune navigated pressures from larger powers, internal factional strife between the moderate Verdi, for example, the green Ghibellines, often more pragmatic moderates, and the radical Secchi, the dry Ghibellines, more extreme hardliners. All right. And in the ambition, so obviously within the same Ghibelline faction, you have actually more moderates were the popular ones, whereas the dry Ghibellines were sort of the hardliners, probably in a sense of Ghibelline fate, of again sense of transcendence, of command, of spiritual warfare, sacred knighthood, and so on. Also, you have the ambitions of the condottieri, bishops who combine spiritual and temporal authority in ways that often blur the line between ecclesiastical office and seigneurial rule, with figures like the aforementioned Guido Tarlati, the Ghibelline warrior bishop of Arezzo from 1312 until his death in 1327, from the powerful Tarlati clan of Pietramala, who these were different branches of, for again, older nobilities of the countryside, who became signore and aggressively expanded territories, exemplifying the fusion of mitre and sword in pursuit of territorial expansion and defiance of papal authority. That made Arezzo a focal point for both Ghibelline resistance and Guelph retaliation across Tuscany, Umbria, and the Marche, where its actions repeatedly drew in coalitions of cities and lords from distant regions, in a pattern of escalation and linked local disputes to broader Italian struggles over imperial legitimacy and papal temporal power. This is at least the beginning of this period, witnesses to Boniface VIII, who called himself Caesar and stressed the ecclesiastical temporal power. And this was very much also a case of clash against Arezzo that, by the way, as you can see from some of the maps I inserted here, also borders the papal states as a whole, which doesn't really mean much because at this point the papal states are still like a broader world that more or less recognizes that those lands belong to the church, even though some communes, especially the Ghibelline ones, are a bit on their own. They recognize the emperor, and everything is mostly a matter of networks. And so that part of Central Italy works essentially just like the rest of it, with the communes and fighting against one another, etc. In the opening years of the century, Arezzo actively participated in regional Ghibelline operations designed to counter Guelph expansion and maintain corridors for movement southward and eastward. Right. So much of what we're seeing today is how the Aretinians infiltrated, right, pretty much everywhere in the surrounding regions, in particular Umbria, the Marches, or the Romagnol area as well, aside from Tuscany, because there is the greater power that they have to fear is Florence, because that also literally borders the Aretinian countryside, so they're actual neighbors. But Florence is expanding normally on the other side. This actually the surrounding the frontier with Arezzo is very important for many reasons, because there is the upper Arno Valley that is very strategic. But the Florentines mostly fight further west against the Lucchese, the Pisans, and so on. And because those countrysides are richer, Florence wants a let out on the sea. It has to act through Siena, that at this point is de facto becoming inoxidably black Guelph, because they had been Ghibelline, as we were saying before, in the previous century, but that they had also had some sort of whitening. Consider that within the cities, with Arezzo, it's actually not so evident, because more or less there were always the Ghibellines in it, right? This is relatively rare, but it tells you how close-knit the Aretinians really were. Also, it's a smaller community compared to the bigger centers. But if you look at Florence, if you look at Siena, you have tendentially different factions that would like to seize power in different ways, even though they pivoted around their main city, right? So I made lots of videos about the Italian communes, and you've seen how many exiles normally existed, and these mostly were, again, noblemen, knights, people who went over fighting for the enemy neighbors and trying to infest the native countryside from their own possessions that were rarely and simply eradicable from the commune. They wanted to clear them, right? So this is particularly pronounced in the Apennine hinterland that characterizes eastern Tuscany, and that's where the Aretinians play, crossing the same Apennines and getting to the Adriatic. That obviously is connected with these clashes also in Tuscany and beyond. So it's all very strategic, and it's not even soft power. It's literally like direct intervention from the side of these Masnata that really, in their own small scale, carried out pretty big disasters for those who were involved in them. Notably, there isn't any major battle really for this timeline. There were many different clashes, also in open field, etc. But as you will see now, they're fairly modest. Nothing ever more in the several tens of thousands, at least as it had been. That was a coalition host, like at Campaldino with, there were not even 10,000 at least from the Aretinian side. The Florentines were more. In any case, in January 1300, Orvieto occupied, this is another towns out in the Papal States, the passes of the Chiana Valley, specifically to block Aretine cavalry from descending to the Maremma, where they intended to link with allied forces. With this measure reflected the broader Guelph effort to isolate Arezzo geographically from the papacy, and prevent reinforcement of southern Ghibelline positions tied to the Aldobrandeschi house, the powerful noble family controlling much of southern Tuscany, including the Counts of Santa Fiora, that were long-standing Ghibelline allies whose lands in the Maremma provided strategic depth and resources against papal expansion. The Counts of Santa Fiora inhabited essentially the southeastern part of the Sienese countryside, so they were Ghibellines, good examples of what we're just saying, in the commentatus of a Guelph commune, right? And naturally were a problem. These areas are very, again, hilly, typical Tuscan landscape. Some of these southern parts of Maremma are even relatively dry, and it's a very tough fighting ground with lots of guerrilla ambushes, etc. The Aretinians maintained close ties with the Aldobrandeschi Counts of Santa Fiora, bound by shared opposition to Boniface VIII's claims over Margherita Aldobrandeschi through her marriage arrangements and the papal assertion of feudal rights over disputed territories that threatened to redraw local balances and sever traditional Ghibelline networks essential for mutual defense, resource sharing, and coordinated military action against common Guelph adversaries who sought to encircle and reduce Aretine autonomy through economic and military pressure. In May to June 1301, Aretine forces aided Ghibellines in expelling Guelphs from Gubbio. We are in Umbria. Gubbio is an important commune. Although Perugia, that is Black Guelph, and it's basically the cornerstone. I made a video about medieval Perugia, by the way, in general, if you're interested. And thus, the cornerstone of papal action in the very center, in the very heart of the Apennine, is a sizable city. It's the largest in Umbria and in this Apenninic part of central Italy. Quickly restored the exiles and drove the Aretines out in a pattern that repeated in August 1303, when similar intervention again failed against Perugian-backed forces intent on securing Umbrian approaches and denying Arezzo influence over eastern routes vital for linking with the Marcojan and Romagnol allies, who provided manpower in strategic depth against the expanding Guelph leagues centered on Florence and Bologna, that coordinated their efforts through shared diplomacy and joint commands. All right. This is particularly relevant because Bologna is basically the last Emilian city in the east, and then there is Romagna that is much more fragmented. There are lots of coalitions. It's a very turbulent area. The marches are even worse, but they are. This is gradually all across this axis because they're increasingly poorer, right? But for this reason, also relatively unstable. And those areas produce lots of mercenaries, of people that come to fight just for plunder. And reward. Naturally, some of these troops are properly salaried by the communes and so on. Some of the best condottieri of this era, think about the Montefeltro that had fought also for Arezzo, right? You have Guido of Montefeltro that reformed the Pisan army that will become the most tactically effective in this entire period, right, in Italy, and was one, again, of the greatest armies in Europe, as a matter of fact. And he was just a guy from the Apennines, from this rough mountaineer clans that specialized in military training and everything. Guido's son, Buonconte, had died, famously enough, because it's depicted by Dante in the Commedia, at the Battle of Campaldino for the Aretinians. His body was never found, so there is all a beautiful legend about like how his body was taken away from the devil while his soul was actually saved by an angel, because he devoted himself to the Virgin, having really repented for his sins, like with a thunderstorm that basically swelled the river, the stream where he had fallen, as it was basically disgorged. And when he died, the body was never found, was carried away. That's beautiful Dante's sort of imagery about this for explaining something that was dreadfully common, namely not being able to identify bodies after those massacres in particular, right? We are told that an actual thunderstorm broke out after the battle. And so you have a tendency from especially the Ghibellines, because that's a contentious statement, but it is really true that tendentially the Ghibellines were more military specialized than the Guelphs. They were more knightly, they had some sort of greater affinity with the seigneurial and traditional mentality, and they were thus really creating, as we'll see now, lots of problems to the Guelphs in the Romagnol and the Marquesan area that, let's point it out, were technically papal states. But again, at this point, and I also made multiple videos on the papacy could not really control these places. Mostly they controlled the area around Rome, and they could just count on good allies like Perugia, as we said. But beyond that, it was a mess. There was technically some legate that operated on behalf of the Pope there, but there are uprisings that, as we'll see now, the Aretinians are leading from literally from Arezzo, because there isn't actually in this area any bigger Ghibelline commune than Arezzo. And so it became so important for these Eastern Italians to side at some point with it, and for Arezzo to be able to stem a great deal of sort of Guelph link-up across, say, the Romagnol area in Umbria. That never really happened because there were the Aretinians and also, obviously, Romagnol, Marques, and Ghibellines in between, all right? Later that year, we are again in 1302, Arezzo sheltered Florentine Bianchi exiles, including the Cerchi, Uberti, Pazzi, Guidalotti, Abati, Gangalandi, Lamberti, Soldanieri, Infangati, and the same Dante Alighieri, whose real name was Durante the Altichiero degli Altichieri, that, as we've seen in the video about Charles of Valois, after formed the university, so-called, there of the Whites in Arezzo now, and planned operations from San Godenzo in Mugello in June. Now, speaking of Dante, that truly lives there in Arezzo for a while. We don't know too much with precision, but he definitely participated to those campaigns after he had actually fought himself against the Aretinians. The traditional participation of Dante to the Battle of Campaldino is not really disputed, but it's really been criticized, at least from the sources that wanted him to be there. We know that in the same year he participated to the Pisan siege of Caprona, so it's very likely that he was in the army that fought at Campaldino as well. And there are some hints from the same Commedia that seem to sort of simply state that. The fact that he participated directly came from a later source, a humanist from Arezzo, as a matter of fact, that is Leonardo Bruni, who sort of probably wanted to... This letter did exist. Flavius Blondus knew of this, even though he was a humanist rival of the same Bruni. Blondos, Bruni in that age, like they were truly connected with some broader archetypes of traditional meaning. And so it's a bit of a mystery, right? But we know that Dante was around these places for a while, and after he fled Florence in 1302, following the victory of the Black Guelphs, as it was a white one, backed by papal intervention of the the armed hand of Charles of Valois, he joined these other white Guelphs in seeking refuge and plotting return. All right. The podestà of Arezzo at this point was Uguccione della Fagiuola. I don't know how many of you have heard of this. This was actually one of the greatest commanders in European history at that time. He crushed later as the Lord of Pisa, at the head, by the way, of the German knights and also the formidable Pisan army that we were describing before. After the expedition of Henry VII, the massive Guelph host led by the Prince of Taranto. So these were Angevins, right? That included the massive, this is the largest army that took the field at the time in 1315. Well, Uguccione came from those same Emilian Romagnol Apennine military clans that specialize in condottieri warfare, and he was a bit of an opportunist, because he was flattered. He was renowned already at this point as a commander, was sort of lured by the same Pope Boniface VIII at some point to side a bit more with the papacy. And so at this point, he was, for Arezzo, a very prestigious podestà. The podestà at this point was de facto the commander of the local army, right? He was a foreigner, the Italians called foreigners, Italians that, let's say, among Italians, those who came from other cities, because otherwise they recognize themselves as Italians abroad, like all other people. So there's this switch that tells you immediately about this tremendous rivalries that existed among them in the peninsula. But they would become a bit discontent for him. He was, again, a prominent Ghibelline condottiero from a noble family near Massa Trabaria that is a bit there. We talked about Mugello, for example. There's also the area from which the Medici had possessions and were already existing actually at this point among the various Florentine aristocratic families, which is an area of frontier, again, across the Apennines, so very strategic in many ways. And that's why those clans were so skilled, because they could, from even a modest fortified property, they're like dictate lots of interesting things also in the broader valley, with the broader plains where the major communes existed. He was experienced in those turbulent Romagnol campaigns, and previously podestà in various other cities, initially sympathetic and experienced from earlier commands in Romagna and against papal legates such as Guillaume Durand in 1295. These were Frenchmen that naturally worked for the papacy at this point, because they were all aligned, as we've seen again, with France, with the Kingdom of France, with Naples, the Angevin Naples. And they were a bit like the big guns, where when the Italian Guelphs were in trouble, usually they called for these Occitanians or Frenchmen and Neapolitans, because they were more feudal in character. So a handful of them could really complement very well the otherwise were pretty well equipped also Guelph armies that, however, were not as qualitative as the Ghibelline ones, it turns out. The Guelphs were great at defending, but expressing essentially a popular, fortified urban mentality, whereas the Ghibellines were a bit more elite-based, but more sort of feudally tending, even when they ruled from cities anyway, like in this case. And so more qualitative from a military standpoint. This is absolutely true in perspective. It's not a cliche, and it would be interesting to study this also from a traditional point of view. I have been writing something about how by the early 14th century certain Ghibelline traditions still lived strongly on the basis of even very classical, strongly classical concepts of Catholic Roman nature, but I still have to publish this for that matter. And as we were saying before, Uguccione is not incredibly super partis, because, or at least just from the Ghibelline side, because he shifted after promises made during a visit to Rome and alienated the exiles, the So this white Guelphs, that, by the way, when you read white Guelph, just know that regardless of what we normally are told by Dante, the white Guelph is a Ghibelline. All right, they may not be 100% the same because, of course, like Dante would have not really reasoned in terms of civic culture as a Florentine, like, I don't know, a Can Grande della Scala as a lord of Verona in northeastern Italy, but sort of they at least shared politically the same alignment, right? And that's why Dante will end up sort of in exile also in Verona and praising Can Grande as always. But for how many differences could exist, white Guelph means Ghibelline. In terms of political strategic alignment, if you look at these battles, that's always the same case. Like there is never like a white Guelph is fighting along a black Guelph against the Ghibellines. Well, only if they were forced because they were part of the, I don't know, the communal military, right? And the word is kind of defective to the point, but there is never like, I don't know, a white Guelph commune that allies against a black Guelph commune against a Ghibelline commune, right? White Guelphs are always allied with the Ghibellines. And Guccione at this point departed for Forlì amid accusation. Forlì is in Romagna, amid accusations of betrayal tied to papal incentives that promised advancement for his son and reflected the fluid loyalties often induced by curial diplomacy that exploited personal ambition to fracture Ghibelline unity at critical moments when cohesion was most needed to resist Guelph advances. Essentially, Pope Boniface VIII promised Guccione apparently that his son could become a cardinal, right? And these Ghibellines are also tendentially poor, so that's an interesting promise. Now, between 1302 and 1304, Aretine contingents joined larger Ghibelline enterprises in Romagna, including the assault on Cesena in October 1302, where they cooperated with Federico da Montefeltro, Bernardino di Guido da Polenta, and forces from Ravenna and Cervia to occupy the plain up to the Savio River, capture most district castles except Firmignano and Reversano, take Cesenatico, and seize Porto through the betrayal of the podesta there, Mazzolino Mazzolini, that opened the gates after prolonged pressure and allowed consolidation of Ghibelline control over Adriatic access points crucial for supply and reinforcement from northern Italy, while threatening, well, that's technically northern Italy already, but still, while threatening Guelph holdings along the coast and complicating papal efforts to maintain secure communications between Rome and Bologna. Raids deep into Florentine territory from the base of Montaccianico reached Lastra, only 2 miles from Florence in 1303, with destruction and burning along the way as part of coordinated pressure on the Arno Valley that aimed to disrupt Florentine supply lines and demonstrate Ghibelline reach deep into enemy comitatus, the contado, while testing the defensive capacity of Florentine outposts and forcing diversion of resources from other fronts to protect the approaches to the city itself. Right, so you have essentially these are war bands of some sort. Unfortunately, we're not very well documented about them. We know here and there from maybe an early condotta contract or whatever what kind of these people could have been like, but most, and this is where also Dante is somewhere, right? These are essentially proxy wars, we would say today, in as much as the white Guelphs conduct some of them, and you see. Arezzo has to be careful because technically, even though the relations with Florence are not idyllic to begin with, and there is a state of quasi-war most of the time, sending the white Guelphs in as opposed to a Ghibelline, properly a communal force with Aretinian banners, right, unfurled, so to say, is a way to harass the Florentines, but without going at war with them. Right. Naturally, the Florentines know very well that the white Guelphs have received hospitality into the castles of the Aretinian comitatus. Some of those were actually already belonging to those white Guelph houses, so that there isn't much, to sort of strident in those contexts. But it's also obvious that Arezzo is backing them and supplying them, supporting their raids into their contado. This is very interesting because Florence is definitely a giant, but it is also politically softer, and therefore there is always, more or less at this point, the idea that there can be a coup, as we will see now. This, for example, incursion to the Lastra will prelude, as we'll see now, to the year for later, to a very risky and quasi-successful coup at Florence. Right, the Bologna at this point is white Guelph, if I'm not wrong, still. And that's also a problem, obviously, for the papacy, but some of these Ghibellines receive support from there as well. Bologna is a large center. I want to make a video about it soon, as a matter of fact. And this action against Florence is a much more interesting and important thing than the raids in Romagna or the Marches, right? But in terms of military experience, they're all entwined because they're propedeutic, like to also the leveling up, let's say, of those Ghibelline war bands. And so these infiltrations, sometimes in names that you will not probably never ever again hear in your life unless you keep following my content here, especially on the Italian communes, are relevant, and they tell a lot about, by the way, the activity here that is going on. Right, this is something, again, that by intensity you don't really find elsewhere, and especially by the level of documentation. It's one of the best cases of study you can have for medieval warfare. Castiglione, this was a center at the frontier with Florence, submitted to Arezzo in June 1303. And the submission was ratified by the Aretine Council on June the 20th, but Fulciari da Calboli's large Guelph army, that is 2,600 cavalry and 15,000 infantry reinforced by Siena, Lucca, Prato, and Bologna, devastated. So Bologna was actually, again, from the black side, devastated the upper Valdarno Contado in response, destroying Troiana, Montuozzi, Cicogna, Castelvecchio degli Ubertini, and other villas in a punitive sweep that targeted rural strongholds and economic resources to weaken Aretine rural support and force reliance on urban defenses less suited to prolonged attrition warfare that favored the wealthier and more populous Guelph centers. This is very interesting because, as you see, the Aretines basically go at war with Florence. They're saying Aretinians, Aretines, well, it's the same. Aretine is shorter, let's use that. And so here there is actually a massive expedition against Arezzo. So what is interesting here is that the very thickly fortified net of strongholds in the Italian countryside that are basically just a few hundreds of square kilometers all in total, right? But they are really many. Right, and even these bigger armies have difficulties to simply advance, as they have to stop besieging at least larger centers. This tells you how active Arezzo still is, and how the Florentines, because Fulciari da Calboli's army was de facto based on Florentine forces plus allies. This is really typical. All these armies are basically coalition forces. Really strike back at Arezzo. So also the Florentines basically say, no, you attack us, we have to respond and triple down on it, to say the least, and send this massive army. In November 1303, Federico da Montefeltro and Farinata degli Uberti, Farinata is not the same guy from the previous generations, the famous sort of leader that saved Florence after, Ghibelline leader, by the way, after the battle of Montaperti. This is part of the same clan of the Uberti, some, again, the most Ghibelline ones in Tuscany, with Bianchi's support, led by the Count Aginolfo, won at Cennina in Valdambra, defeating the Guelph troops and preventing Florentine resupply of the castle of Laterina through the control of key routes that allowed sustained harassment and protection of Aretine flanks against counter-raids that sought to reclaim lost ground and restore Florentine dominance over the upper Arno. This is, again, particularly important because the Aretines managed to push back the Guelphs, where in another. Obviously, these campaigns are not going on forever, but they managed to basically maintain the castle of Laterina, it was very important. The Guelphs had been besieging, trying to strip the Aretines of that. That would remain actually a shield on the Aretine western frontier with Florence. The failed Bianchi assault on Florence in July 1304 saw Aretine participation alongside Baschieri della Tosa and Tolosano degli Uberti. These were Florentines that had led basically a coup into the city, while interestingly enough, the Florentinian army was involved elsewhere. There is all the issue of Pistoia here. We're not talking much about Florentine politics, but it would have, an important role, like in explaining why, for example, Florence was not properly defended at that point, so this coup could be attempted. But still, the Florentines basically managed to defend successfully. The Aretines are defeated together with the broader coalition at the Lastra under scorching heat, where in July, with 400 losses, including many from heat exhaustion, which happened. People literally died on the spot because of dehydration and sheer exhaustion on the Cafaggio. This was a waterless position that was apparently very ill advised for planning the attack. But the thing is more complicated. I wish we could digress on the various engagements, but in any case, the Aretines under Federico da Montefeltro managed to recapture Laterina, because Laterina had actually been seized by the Florentines, but the Aretines managed during the crisis of the Lastra for Florence to retake it. Where on July the 25th, this was poorly defended without Gualtirotto. They barred and constructed a tower on its gate, securing the upper Arno corridor for 15 years at that point, providing a former base, as we were saying before, against Florentine incursions that remained a thorn in Florentine planning for over, again, a decade and required constant vigilance and reinforcement to prevent the renewed Ghibelline trust toward the city itself that could have threatened its very survival during periods of internal division, as we will see later. What is interesting, by the way, is that on the same day of the Battle of the Lastra, from which the Aretines actually take away to their own city the chains of a gate of Florence, Francesco Petrarca was born in Arezzo, son of Messer Petrarca, and as you know, he lived on to be one of the greatest men of letters, the founder of humanism, like in the history of mankind, not just of Europe or of Italy. And so, for telling you that he knew Dante, for example, like not just Petrarch, I mean his father, for example. So, just for telling you how close these events are to even some figures that we tend to think of in some abstract, ideal sense, but we're actually living across these issues. And it's also interesting that the Aretinian annals do not actually describe the Battle of the Lastra as a total disaster, probably because they were just concerned about their own contingent, and so they saw probably also the same Florentines as, meddling in their own affairs, not really. So this didn't affect Arezzo more than much, or at least, yes, they wish Florence had been taken. But the war coalition didn't concretize to carry out the final push inside the city. The Florentines, for the few troops that had remained in the city, managed to repel the invaders by using torsion catapults across with enfilade fire into the city's streets, where that was dreadfully as bloodily affected. That was very communal, right? The forces of the commune, also to disperse riots or whatever, they took out the ballistas, right? That's very practical of mine. Now the mid 1300, and actually this is interested in a broader sense, because if you think about even urbanistics in Europe up to the contemporary era, think about the great boulevards of the 19th century, those were actually built for the same purpose, right? Putting a cannon at the bottom of that, so that if an angry mob attacked, you could simply shoot across, and so it would have been easier to disperse attacks. In medieval cities where everything was much more packed and the streets were normally small, like the main center for coups was the main one, the one of in the Italian communes is usually the one of the palace, right, of the government, of the commune. Then there is the one of the cathedral. They could be both at the same time. There's the market on the other side. Open ground where a distant army can assemble. So the first who seizes the square normally wins the coup, unless you also barricade inside the palace that was built in stone. There are massive fortresses. Look at the Palace of the Signoria in Florence, but also the Aretinian buildings that you see in the pictures are sort of typical, especially of that era, right? There were massive skyscrapers for the time and fortresses, castles within the city, as a matter of fact. And so normally, like if you concentrate enough forces there, whoever came from the narrow streets did not stand much of a chance, because they would pour in detail, so they could be defeated in detail before they could assemble in any meaningful formation. Right, this is very relevant. Otherwise, if you're a knight and you have to cross those narrow streets, good luck to you, because infantry there can easily cut you down. And also overall in the bigger square, even though cavalry charges existed there as well. Now, so the mid-1300s, as we will see now, brought repeated attempts to exploit imperial or anti-Angevin opportunities amid ongoing raids and defensive stands that tested Aretine resilience against numerically superior coalitions, drawn from multiple Guelph cities united by shared interest in containing Ghibelline resurgence and preserving the balance of power in central Italy. All right, if you look at Tuscany, that is the main sort of bringer of consequences for Arezzo, regardless of its back sort of side Apenninic and even Adriatic activities. In fact, they were confined there because they couldn't quite play in Tuscany. You realize that the dominant powers obviously were Guelph, right? Florence, Siena alone, in between gradually San Gimignano, Volterra, etc. And also Prato, Pistoia, as they were gradually taken by the Guelphs, right? So it's a massive power. Again, consider that Florence is literally the richest, in absolute terms, the richest city in the world. And there is, however, this paradox that in spite of such wealth, Florence gets beaten repeatedly by her neighbors. The Florentines had the largest, most magnificent armies, whatever, but they weren't so politically cohesive because they were more relaxed, bigger city, more difficult to control. And so even, you see, the castle of Laterina, that wasn't sort of an impregnable fortress in absolute terms, alone, naturally united with the fact, as we said before, that Arezzo was also a secondary objective for Florence in general most of the time, would do to shield the Aretines for a while, for decades, as a matter of fact, from Florence. In 1305, Soffredo de Verduoli led Aretines in support of Pistoia against the Angevin Florentine siege of Ostina, assembling 1,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry with Bolognese and Romagnol Ghibellines in a coalition effort that hoped for imperial intervention to counter Angevin pressure, but the campaign collapsed when Albert of Austria, this is Albert of Habsburg, the son of Rudolf, promised 20,000 gold florins split between his Alpine crossing and arrival in Tuscany, declined intervention. And because the Habsburgs were always a step away from entering Italy, but they would actually never do it, right? Rudolf planned, I think, 4 times an Italian expedition, but Germany was way more messed up to mind about. And in this sense, also Albert, this is obviously after the death of Rudolf, declined intervention. And Robert of Anjou's ultimatum for submission went thus unanswered amid Angevin dominance that forced withdrawal after Ostina's capitulation following stubborn defense, and highlighted the fragility of Ghibelline coordination without external backing from a credible imperial presence capable of shifting the balance of forces through direct military intervention or credible threat. A wait for the Luxembourgs. Napoleone Orsini. Napoleone Orsini is a very interesting figure. He's essentially a cardinal. As such, you would expect like a Guelph, but he actually plays a bit the role of pacifier in Tuscany by siding with the Ghibellines, balancing up like the situation. These were incredibly rich and affluent people. They were very influent. They knew lots of people. So he becomes for a while at the head of Arezzo. He establishes his legate, because he was a papal legate technically, his legatine base in Arezzo in 1306, preaching, however, a crusade against whom? The Ghibellines, that also had problems with at least accusations of heresy, against Florence, because he had some issues with Florence personally, with indulgences equivalent to those against the Saracens, and attracting militias from Lazio, Marche, Spoleto, Romagna. This is all the sort of relative backwater of the relatively less developed areas where lots of Ghibellines and some backbone of Ghibelline knighthood remains very, very alive, very inflamed, like exalted, ignited by these fantasies of conquest, of self-sacrifice in holy combat, and so on. You have the Tuscan whites as well, obviously participating, and the Ghibellines through from various places through the legate diplomatic maneuvering and wealth derived from banking ties, despite losses from Florentine failures that reduced his funds and tested his ability to sustain prolonged operations against a well-organized Guelph League that commanded greater financial and logistical resources through taxation and alliances. It's always the same old story. Like, the Guelphs are richer, they're more powerful, they're all connected with the Western European banking that they control effectively themselves. They have the stronger allies. The French, the Angevins are there in Italy. The Germans are north of the Alps at this point. The 1307 campaign saw Orsini. The Orsini were, however, also a staunchly Guelph family from Rome, but it was also an extended clan, so you could have this changes, right? Assembled 1,700 knights at Arezzo. This is a respectable force, right? It is double the Aretine cavalry at the Battle of Campaldino. And the reason is that Arezzo becomes, again, the center of all this greater strategic logistical effort against the Guelphs now. For telling you how, again, Arezzo is a relatively small center, but how active it is, how sort of, aggressive and courageous and unwavering it is in its Ghibelline fate. Florentine forces under Ferrantino Malatesta, you see, these were condottieri from Romagna in fighting, in fact, there against the Aretines that went over to support the Montefeltro, for example, with 3,000 cavalry and 15,000 infantry, including Spanish contingents. This were the Almogavars that the Angevins, after the end of the wars of the Vesper, had hired to stiffen the Guelph garrisons. They were actually not very capable, honestly. In Italy, they really made very poor display of themselves. Heavy cavalry dominated in Italy. The Almogavars never do something like, the Battle of Cephissus against the Athenians at Similia. Actually, the Italians at some point get rid of them, and they increase their reliance on French and German men-at-arms, as a matter of fact. But this is a big coalition. You have all these guys, and at least because the Almogavars were typically infantry, but there were also some Catalan noblemen that, with their retinues, made also good horsemen, especially in this hilly grounds of Tuscany. So with lots of hit-and-run tactics, etc., at some point it will be successful, even against the Germans in the skirmishes, however, during Henry VII's expedition, in any case. But mostly, again, these are Florentines, Sienese. The Sienese are under Guido di Arduino. Also forces from Montepulciano. This massive contingent devastates the Val d'Ambra. Remember, this is directed against the legate that is settled in Arezzo. And so you realize that Florence doesn't kid around. She's very angry at this guy and the Aretines that shelter him. And this force destroys 15 Ubertini castles, just to eradicate great part of their assets, and besieged Gargonza, where the Aretines and the Whites resisted strenuously against siege towers and prepared demolitions, while Siena delayed reinforcements and Volterra ignored commitments, drawing Orsini's interdict against those cities for their hesitation and exposing cracks in Guelph unity that Orsini sought to exploit through targeted ecclesiastical pressure aimed at dividing the league further. This is a bit always the problem of the Guelphs. They're richer, more powerful, but also saying, why are we even fighting here? Like, yeah, we see it's a problem, it's a threat, but war is very costly and nothing lasts forever. Panic induced by Orsini's march towards Florence at this point via the Casentino Valley from Romena, possibly and most dangerously coordinated with Corso Donati, the Black Baron of Florence, that might have opened the gates amid internal Guelph tensions and fears of betrayal. In fact, within the same Florence, forced the Florentine withdrawal in disorder over 120 kilometers in 2 days and a night, abandoning equipment and siege machinery. Right? This is very interesting. The Aretine annalists recorded the episode as a defensive success despite internal flight of citizens and peasants from the Green Ghibelline faction who fled amid rumors and disorder that weakened the city's immediate response, and exposed underlying social strains between urban and rural elements under prolonged military strain that drained manpower and eroded cohesion, while highlighting the limits of purely defensive strategy against mobile Guelph armies, right? And the Florentines, from their side, this is Villani that is sort of the most important source of the siege of Gargonza and this sudden withdrawal. Villani naturally was very interested in Corso Donati, that eventually will be assassinated during a coup in Florence and so on. This was one of the most powerful individuals in Florence. Again, Charles of Valois had basically backed him and vice versa back years before. He could really become the lord of Florence, right? And Villani says that actually the Aretines could have even successfully linked up with Corso Donati, and that would have been a disaster, right? But Villani says this for almost every situation where the Florentines didn't shine particularly, and said if it hadn't been for this thing, he probably was right. But we'll never fully know what happened there. So some of these events are also not fully explained in their political and operational way, also because there surely were lots of context behind the scenes, all these sort of attempts at coups, etc. What we described as far as Italian communal warfare is extremely interesting, is that these cities were just a few tens of kilometers away from one another, right? Here between Florence and Arezzo is not even too sort of short of a distance, because there are all these valleys, these reliefs in between. However, they're also very close places. So these are basically the same people. They speak the same language. They have, regardless of sort of provincial differences and whatever, they kind of are the same Tuscans, but they manage, on top of their power, to remain separated, to remain single standing city-states, all managing to mind their own business. Look at these wars. I mean, tens of thousands of men mobilized against a city like Arezzo these are expeditions you never hear, and sort of the armies of Azincourt were just, smaller than these, for telling you how, no criterion seems to exist even in terms of historiographical and pop cultural awareness regarding these topics. Internal Ghibelline divisions intensified after 1308, right? Complicated military cohesion and exposing vulnerabilities to external pressure in Arezzo that exploited factional rifts to undermine collective defense and facilitate Guelph penetration into the Contado. Uguccione della Fagiola's failed relief of Corso Donati in October 1308, marching from Arezzo with 400 cavalry and 4,000 infantry to Remole, but deceived by a false messenger claiming Corso's capture, because that's where Corso was rising up, and Guccione would have had to come into his support. It was a massive urban battle between Corso's partisans and the commune that was stemming this Donati's attempt at regime change, weakened the same Guccione position amid accusations of divided loyalties. Also here there is the problem, why didn't Guccione actually arrive there? In any case, he might have been compromised. Somebody might have bribed him, or maybe there was really a difficulty in linking up or timing, the expedition during the coup and so on. This fueled distrust, however, among allies, right? Probably among the Ghibellines, and eroded confidence in his leadership. Guccione stayed in Arezzo here and there. We don't even know exactly when he had come back, etc. But everybody remembered how sort of unloyal he had been at some point. And that's where the Tarlati emerge as the future seigneurial power of Arezzo that was instead courageously loyal and Ghibelline and Aretine and never defected, etc., and really managed to pull off, as we'll see now, some major feats. The Tarlati faction briefly seized power in the city amid clashes between the Verdi moderates and the Secchi extremists, as we've seen, only to be expelled by the popolo after arming against their excesses, destroying Tarlati buildings and building a battifolle, which is essentially a fortress opposite Pietramala, to monitor their rural base and prevent further incursions from their strongholds that threatened civic autonomy and control over the contado through intimidation and taxation. It was typical, as we were saying before, if you want to harass the commune, just cut its supply lines right from the countryside. Don't make the harvest arrive. Be relentless in that pressure, and somebody in the city may open the gates to you and you will take over the entire system. This is what will end up happening with the Tarlati, as a matter of fact. There are really very noble, intact figures that the Aretines like, at least probably the extremist Ghibellines, the truest Ghibellines. By 1309-1310, Guccione regained control of Arezzo as podestà and captain, with peasant reinforcements under Nieri di Donoratico, but Florentine incursions and defeats in February 1310 near Cortona, where he lost Vanni de Tarlati, Cione de Gherardini, and a Pazzi amid pursuit to the Monte under Cortona after the Guelph devastation in the Valdarno and Vallelunga, eroded Guccione's authority, despite consolidation through expulsions of Gonfalonieri and false justifications for power grabs that masked growing factional resentment and eroded popular support for prolonged warfare that drained resources and morale while exposing the commune to repeated punitive expeditions that targeted the contado and weakened its economic base. Also here, we don't know exactly what happened. Essentially, near Cortona, there is this mountain, and it was yet another importantly sized Guelph army that arrived from the west. The Aretines were not very numerous at this point. The cardinal was not there anymore, so they had to count on their own resources, and Guccione opts for an ambush, right? The Aretines do, and this is very interesting because the same Battle of Montecatini later on, also the Battle of Ponte Trento was a prelude to that, will be an ambush, de facto. So Guccione surely knew how to carry these things out, or at least maybe was experimented there. You have the peasants backing him, because Pisa is fighting at this point against Florence, that is expanding against down the lower Arno Valley toward the sea. And Guccione seems compelled, because of his peasant contacts, to carry out the war against Florence. You have to understand his perspective from Arezzo. But at this point, Arezzo, while being very Ghibelline, looks at this guy, says this guy was not loyal before. He seems to be acting on behalf of somebody else, even though the peasants are technically allies, without any doubt. They send even help forces across Tuscany, interestingly enough, across the enemy comitatus. However, what happened at the mountain under Cortona seems to have brought to, again, this loss of very important knights. So the Aretines failed. Guccione escaped with his life, right? Vanni de Tarlati died, right? The Tarlati, again, had been repressed, but some of them continued to cooperate with the commune. You have the Gherardini, the Pazzi, these were all quite important. Ghibellines and Whites, etc. And so the Aretines say, this is too much, really, right? This guy can't stay any longer. And in fact, that's also at the point that Uguccione defiles himself and goes over to Pisa, where he will have actually great military fortune for those battles. Eventually, he will die exiled, if I'm not wrong, in that hands, under Cangrande, interestingly enough. So actually, Dante would have met him there. He probably would have already seen him in Arezzo, as we've seen, where he fought also battles and carried out flank attacks together with Cangrande, that also was one of the most clamorously successful commanders out there. I mean, he took over armies that were incredibly larger than him, almost to suicidal fanatism, and he won all the time in those instances. So we shall make a video about Cangrande because it's like, incredible to say the least. Then the major event, so to say, the highlight is the arrival of Henry VII in 1312-1313. He was already there for a couple of years, starting from the north, where he managed to turn the tides, as you know, of Ghibelline Guelph balance, as basically almost northern Italy is brought under a Ghibelline rule by his expedition. Henry eventually passes into Tuscany from Pisa, by the way, and he had already suffered important amount of losses in the north, but the Italians replenished his ranks and so on. He came with this German, so-called, the Italians called them Burgundians. It were basically Lorrainese, people living across the sort of France and the Empire. And there is no major pitched battle in Henry VII's expedition. As we'll see now, also, the Florentines shut themselves into their own gates. There wasn't even like a complete wall, but the city was so big and there were so many Guelphs in the city that Henry couldn't take it. But his arrival in Tuscany is a huge deal, because obviously at that point everybody has prepared to this major war. And this moment marks for Arezzo a high point of imperial alignment. Arezzo welcomed the emperor that had already been crowned in Rome. First, he arrived in Italy as king of the Romans. In Rome, there is, at this point in 1312, the largest urban battle in the Middle Ages. You may want to notice if you wonder which one it was, and I will make a video about it. We are in September 1312, and this is really a mystical moment. If you read it from the sources, you have the impression that there is this visit also to sacred places. There is the sanctuary of Averna nearby. Arezzo has a very important also spiritual history, and the symbolism of Romanity, of imperial tradition, is revived. Henry arrives to Arezzo after his passage from Todi in Umbria, having not seen an emperor in 2 centuries amid mostly Florentine harassment. The Aretines are really enthusiastic, right? Henry VII of Luxembourg, Holy Roman Emperor, elected as King of Germany, King of the Romans in 1308, and so to restore imperial authority across all of Italy, even claiming specifically the inheritance of Conrad, of at least of imperial legacy in southern Italy. Right? He died before getting there. He could have actually taken Naples, and people tend to downplay his impact in Europe during the expedition, etc., because Dante said, okay, well, he died, so that's a tragedy. Yes, but it's not like it didn't change anything, right? On this occasion, the emperor grants privileges to the Tarlati. Again, he was physically there with them, including Guido, the bishop, that is put in charge, essentially, of Arezzo as a lord from July the 7th, 1312. Right? You have Tarlatino, Pier Saccone. These are all together with the major sort of figures of the Tarlati house. This practice is very important because if you look at the Visconti, the Della Scala, etc., they were already there before and already lords before the arrival of Henry VII. But this guy confers them imperial vicariates to them and strongly reinforces their control over northern Italy in that case. So he does actually the same thing with the Tarlati, basically making them some of the most important Ghibelline lords in Italy in this way. Regardless of the fact that, again, Arezzo was a relatively defiled commune, without much, like, I don't know, a sea outlet or whatever. Like, he was very close to the mountains, very sort of isolated, pressed. This is naturally the high point of imperial power, so there was still the idea now that, as we'll see from Arezzo itself, the emperor went over to besiege Florence, right, with his own army, plus the Aretines. But still, because, of course, together with Pisa, the fact that this was the only Ghibelline Tuscan center, and in a very opposite, probably, direction, in location in Tuscany from Pisa, so quite strategically relevant. Henry collected on this occasion oaths from 500 Ghibelline nobles, including the Tarlati, the Ubaldini, the Uberti, the Alberti, the Counts of Magone and Montedolio, the Marquis of the Apennine, the same Uguccione that is actually around, right? The Pazzi, because he's not yet Lord of Pisa, but he'll become after the emperor's death, and the Pietramala, in a display of regional solidarity that strengthened the imperial cause locally and provided a momentary unity against Guelph leagues formed to block, meanwhile, his advance through control of passes and alliances with cities like Lucca and Siena that coordinated their resistance. Also in Tuscany, the arrival of Henry VII will change actually a lot, and especially through Uguccione. Again, if you're interested in this, please check out my videos about medieval Pisa, the second one about later Middle Ages, because there it explains what Uguccione really did and how Montecatini could happen. This was largely, possibly the largest actually, battle in medieval Europe, Western-wise, and as far as we understand it. We may never know about other exaggerations, but this one is overwhelmingly well documented. There were at least 50,000 men involved in that battle. Aretine contingents supported imperial operations in the Valdarno against Siena, occupying Casole in January 1313. So this is actually after the failed siege of Florence that lasted just a couple of months, and Henry was obliged to pull out in the bad season at night, crossing the Arno, like under the rain of this kind of terrible situation. There is all a guerrilla in winter across the Chianti hills. And we don't know too much about what the Aretines particularly did, but they were there, and they carry out this operation in Casole under Federico da Montefeltro and Uguccione with 700 cavalry, guided by Ranieri del Porrina, though they got defeated at Cangaretta with 150 losses. So this is, again, pretty bloody clashes. Binduccio d'Aldobrandino and Binduccio di Ripi de Cacciaconte with Aretine and Ubertini cavalry took Sinalunga in February, resisting Sienese siege until capitulation in May, with privileges restored to the Binduccio brothers amid negotiated terms that preserved some local autonomy and allowed continued Ghibelline presence in the Val di Chiana through tribute arrangements. This is, again, also very interesting because you see how, regardless of this bigger storm of the imperial passage, etc., like the various lords locally tried to exploit the situation at their own advantage. Like this, for example, remained entrenched somewhere during these clashes until May, when the imperial army had already passed and come back to Pisa, right? In August of 1313, the Aretines sent 200 cavalry and 2,000 infantry to Pancole under Federico da Montefeltro, Guccione di Pazzi, di Ubertini, and Valdambra forces, inflicting heavy damage on the Sienese valued over 20,000 gold florins through depredations, until Henry's death, famously enough at Bonconvent on August the 24th from malaria, an event that scattered Ghibelline hopes and prompted mourning processions through Castelfranco di Paganico. As surviving contingents regrouped and shifted focus to local defense against anticipated Guelph reprisals now that sought to exploit the sudden vacuum of imperial leadership through coordinated campaigns that targeted remaining Ghibelline outposts, as we've seen. This is naturally very interesting because you see that as long as the imperial armies are around, the Ghibellines have the upper hand, and so the Aretines can project their predations up to Siena. And so you see here there is a western, again, roaming and targeting that was unheard of before, right? The Sienese and the Aretines had actually been battling against one another in the late 13th century, and so they actually had a frontier in common which was much wider, right? And they tended not to go at one another. In particular, the Sienese were actually very smart in many ways at this point, and I also made videos about Siena that explains this. The Aretines here are sort of getting as much as they can, but as soon, obviously, as the emperor dies, the expedition falters, like everything. Like, actually, the German mercenaries start to come back to Germany. They will be hired again by Uguccione in peace, and then again you have in 1314 Pontetetto, actually 1313, which brings Lucca under Ghibelline control, and then Montecatini, where at that point, as we will see, that the Aretines will cooperate with Uguccione to kind of press on to the gates of Florence, and so actually the big war has just begun. However, Arezzo also wises up and levels up, especially in governance, because Guido Tarlati, elected, as we've seen, leader, probably as bishop and lord of Arezzo in 1312, like a truly warrior bishop. He's a knight, he's a commander. He really incarnates the sort of condottieri aura, even though he wasn't a condottiere. That was technically not where the condottieri really begin in the 15th century to be also lords, and vice versa. I made a video also about Gianfrancesco Gonzaga in the 15th century. It was one of my earliest videos on Schwerpunkt, even though we haven't talked about the condottieri very much. And Guido consolidates his position in Arezzo. There is a political normalization in favor of the Ghibelline cause. Amidst turmoil, it's partly a metus hostilis, but also just Uguccione is away. There is, again, this imperial sanction of the Tarlati that is sort of fundamental. So much so that Guido proclaimed himself Signore for life, supported by the Aretines. Like, we are in August 1321. In fact, there is a unanimous vote of 400 citizens. There is happening after the initial one-year term that transforms Arezzo into the most aggressive Ghibelline power in Tuscany, right? And the Marche as well, through fortification, conquest, and alliance building that extended influence far beyond the city walls and challenged papal sovereignty directly in a manner that provoked repeated ecclesiastical sanctions and military coalitions aimed at Guido's removal. The fact that Arezzo would truly become this inoxidably, or Ghibelline that had always been, I'd say also relentlessly active Ghibelline center, can be said even over Pisa or Lucca, because those at some point, like, they were more pragmatic, and or say Lucca was not really as militarized as Arezzo in a sense. Pisa was, as we've seen, actually provided with the best army out there, but it was a bigger power, and at some point had to declare a truce. They weren't always fighting against the Florentines just per se. If anything, it was the Florentines that kept creeping towards the west, right? So instead, Arezzo becomes a model of Ghibelline leadership, even though Tuscany, in fact, doesn't quite have that seigneurial bias that Arezzo has instead. And that tells you how more traditional and primitive, in a way, Arezzo was at this point, compared to the more tendentially popular Republican communes, the bigger ones of Tuscany, that are tendentially Guelph, right? Guido allied with Castruccio Castracani, right? This guy that really was a favorite of Edward the first at some point in England. He had likely fought in Flanders against the Flemish on behalf of the French. He had fought with Uguccione and eventually would become Lord of Lucca, as we will see now, and scored after Montecatini the second strongest defeat on Florence at Altopascio. You have Federico da Montefeltro, are always around, to these lords from the northern Apennines. And later, the same Ludwig of Bavaria that I made a video on months ago, Ludwig of Wittelsbach, Ludwig IV, Holy Roman Emperor. Guido will provide cavalry for Castruccio's occupations, such as Pontremoli in May 1321, to secure Lombard reinforcements from those Apennine passes, and also some so-called scorrerie. So these are some raids into the Florentine Contado. In June of that year, that devastated areas near Fucecchio and Carmignano for 20 days, while neutralizing threats from allied Malaspina branches loyal to the empire and opening paths for further incursions that threatened Florentine control over the western approaches. Right. But importantly enough, Aretine forces contributed to a very important degree to the Ghibelline victory at Montecatini on August the 29th, 1315. And again, this is the biggest battle ever. And so just imagine participating to it. And you have there Pier Saccone Tarlati leading 150 noblemen amid an army of 3,000 cavalry and 20,000 infantry from the Ghibelline side, including contingents from the Pazzi of Valdarno, the Count of the Aldobrandeschi Mark of Santa Fiora, the Ubertini, and the Visconti of Lombardy that had come, like on occasion, under Uguccione. Heavy losses included Bonafidanza, with 5 nobles. This is from the Aretinian contingent, Niccolò de Buscoli, Astoldo de Testi, and Manfredo de Clusio, amid the rout, however, of the Angevin Florentine force that left the field strewn with banners and equipment captured as trophies displayed in Arezzo to bolster morale and recruit further support from neighboring lords. Right? These heavy losses signal that even though we don't really know where the Aretines were in the Battle of Montecatini, we could even be able to reconstruct that in a way. They definitely got into heavy melee, right? And even though they won, like taking heavy losses means they really distinguished themselves in the front line. It's possible that there were actually some of the feditori at the beginning of the battle that led a suicidal charge, successfully destroying the first Guelph line with the CNAs and others. That's possible, right? So these were some of the most, heroic sort of knights picked for literally suicide at the end of the day, but to in fact to provide with their own army an important advantage starting from the beginning of the battle by breaking the enemy lines and just continuing into the second one by which they were repelled and sort of wiped out. The interesting aspect of this is that the Aretines at Campaldino, that was not that far away in time, as a generation basically, had done exactly the same. The feditori of the Aretines had broken the Florentine ones and had almost broken the entire Florentine army in the first charge. So these Aretinian knights were something to behold, and this is really interesting. We mentioned before, the fact of how that fewer, smaller forces were often more qualitative, more picked, more elite than the bigger ones on average. This is kind of obvious, but the fact that this would be concentrated in the Ghibelline field is quite fascinating. For example, we mentioned Malaspina before. I really want to make a video about Spinetta Malaspina because this guy was just so irrelevant because he had some possessions in the Apennines between the Po Valley and Tuscany, and he wasn't very powerful otherwise. I mean, he had a small asset, but he participated in so many battles, often from the loser side, and he survived all throughout. And he was asked for advice from both Guelphs and Ghibellines across Italy as far as military matters were concerned, because he was like probably incarnating one of those higher models of imperial Catholic traditional knighthood that were incredibly requested in terms of sort of the soul of chivalry doctrine and self-sacrifice in holy combat, etc., that we can't unfortunately know very much about. But the Aretines would have actually known themselves something about it. Unfortunately, we're not better documented about them, but this may be exactly the same indicator of what we're saying, right? Because they didn't care also about much else. Right, Montecatini is a massive Ghibelline victory. Naturally, the Aretines are not protagonists. They are fighting into this big host led by Pisa and Lucca under Uguccione. But they also distinguished themselves, and probably Uguccione gave them some place of honor or something, maybe in the same Feditori, as we conjectured before. Montecatini also opens to a phase of wealth weakness in Tuscany. Florence doesn't fall, because again it's too big, right? And so they actually suck in pitched battles, but they manage to always defend themselves, to stand back on their feet. From Naples, the Angevins sent their French Neapolitan knights, picked forces, but in the meanwhile Arezzo says, finally, like, we can't take a breath of fresh air, because definitely Florence is a bit less aggressive now, a bit less reactive, right? And that's how Guido Tarlati expanded control over the Val di Chiana with Monte San Savino and Lucignano, submitting in 1315-16. So this in the aftermath, properly, of Montecatini. Monte San Savino, these were all, again, burghs of some kind, like fortified settlements, etc. The former had been abandoned by the Florentines for over 10 years. Right, this was Florentine comitatus, or at least had properly been garrisoned by the Florentines, but they had probably been paying someone to be there, but the thing had sort of died out. And taken also annual tribute of 25 pounds for a palio at San Donato as well. San Donato, Saint Donatus, is the patron of Arezzo, by the way. Guido built new walls in Arezzo. He built lots of things in the city, including the Porta of the Holy Ghost, the Gate of the Holy Ghost. When we speak of the Holy Ghost, by the way, speaking of now, like Schwerpunkts aficionados are very much aware of what I'm talking about, as well as the Urban Cerchia. I made last year a video about the Circle of the Italian community, these massive fortified rings of the fact that the medieval metropolises of the world. So we speak naturally and greatly a lot about castles. As we've seen here, Italians didn't lack them. But in terms of historical military engineering, the Middle Ages, like the Italian Circle has something enormous, even just in terms of sheer amount of material resources, something utterly insane, right? Some of these cities had built like 4 rings for how fast they had expanded, and these were massive infrastructures. Florence took decades to finish exactly at this point, the outer third ring that was, again, enormous. And this Cerchia in Arezzo in 1319 enclosed the expanded suburbs from the Holy Cross to Castro, that is the castle in Camposanto, the cemetery, with Ghibelline ramparts, right, that, as you know, were particularly V-shaped, symbolizing defiance against papal and Guelph threats, and provided enhanced defensive depth against siege through improved circuit and gates that incorporated recent advances in fortification technique. Guido, from the top of his power, supported Ghibelline revolts in Assisi in 1319, aiding Muzio di Francesco to sack even St. Francis's treasury. sold in the same Arezzo market square for 14,000 florins amid widespread plunder that funded further operations and arms procurement. Guido himself is quite involved in some campaigns, as we will see now, but that act in particular is a straightforward offense to the church in so many ways, and it's all very Ghibelline, and this is also the age, basically, and I made some videos about this, the sort of dying universalism, the age of Marsilius of Padua, William of Ockham, the latter, as you know, were Ludwig of Wittelsbach's proteges, and the Bavarian was the guy who basically pulled out of Italy, saying, basically we can become emperor just by German election. We don't need the papacy anymore. In any case, it wouldn't really end up truly like that. The two powers would keep supporting each other at some point. But this was, in the crisis of universalism, probably a crumbling period. It's not actually a positive one at all. But that's why these local rulers profit of the situation. Guido also provokes a revolt in the Mark of Ancona. This was also held by the papacy, but there were Ghibellines locally. We're in 1320-21. There, the Ghibellines defeat papal forces at battles near Recanati, Osimo, and Fano, while allied with Uberto, Count of Ghiaggiolo, Paoluccio della Faggiola. Yes, the Faggiolas were there still, because they're clans, essentially, so different members are here and there in all these war bands that Guido de facto pays, leads, etc. And Lipaccio d'Osimo. These are all local Ghibellines in coordinated uprisings that threatened papal temporal authority in the Marche and drew in reinforcements from distant Ghibelline lords through promises of land in office there. So Guido acts truly as some higher master. That tells you how powerful he is in at this point, especially on the Adriatic side. And in fact, the Ghibellines of Romagna received his support in 1321 with the occupations of Cerasolo, Montescudolo, Montegrisolfo under Federico da Montefeltro that receives Aretine troops. Uberto da Ghiaggiolo, again, Paoluccio della Faggiola, with 800 infantry and cavalry from Lucca, Pisa, and Arezzo that established the summer, because there were some Ghibellines that now also from other Tuscan centers, obviously moving more freely around, establishing a summer base at Montefabbri near Urbino for sustained pressure on Rimini, the Malatesta that we've seen before, some of their members even leading that Guelph host into the Aretine Comitatus at the head of the Florentines. And there, surrounding Guelph holdings through raids and blockades that disrupted papal communication. So imagine, again, you have this base where you go as a knight from Arezzo and together with these other guys all around, and you stay there and you launch raids throughout the season, and you come back to Arezzo eventually in the cold one. And so it's all very romantic if it wasn't for obviously the bloodshed, the distractions, and so on that followed there. In 1323-24, Guido orchestrated the nocturnal conquest of Città di Castello in Umbria. This is a very important stronghold, and Umbria is all mountains, basically, so seizing it is really a big deal. And normally, in this incipient crisis of medieval civilization in the mid-14th century, you realize that everybody tends to fortify a bit. We've seen it in Arezzo as well. Power is shrinking more locally, as we were saying, for the collapse of universal authority, and coups are preferred to costly sieges in general, especially in these mountain places. And obviously inside of these communities was always a faction that sided with you, and so it was a matter of supporting it, of plotting, of organizing these regime changes. We are on October the 2nd, 1323, when 300 cavalry under Tarlatino Tarlati Remember, this guy had the most distinguished honor of leading the Aretines at Monte Cassini, right? So think about all the military wisdom, experience, authority of this man. It's incredible. Just imagine them from an anthropological point of view. What does a veteran look like in this war? Like a veteran knight. It's so relevant. Città di Castello was entered by these troops due to the betrayal at the gate of St. Julian. And it brought to the expulsion of Branca Guelfucci and over 400 Guelphs in a bloody reform to Ghibelline rule that prompted Pope John the 22nd to excommunicate Guido Tarlati. That, however, is undefeated in this. He secured Caprese through a spontaneous submission after 60 years of the Counts of Romena rule, with a fixed toll that wouldn't have to exceed 2 gold florins per earth, and the conquest also of Rocca Cinghiata and Usciano by deception and burning of the Romena palace, properly on purpose, sending political shockwaves across the province with some Forlivays and other allied troops. So you have, again, Romagnols that arrive in Umbria and in the Marches and in Tuscany, and that eliminated this long-standing rival stronghold of Caprese, securing the upper Tiber Valley approaches for safe passage of reinforcements. So yes, because the Tiber, as you know, is born in the Romagnol area and then goes down the Apennines, also passing pretty close to Arezzo and Umbria and so on. And what is interesting about, for example, here Caprese, Rondine, etc., is that all these actions are magnificently represented in the cenotaph of Guido Tarlati in Arezzo. You can see them. I inserted, in fact, the pictures here, and they're very easy to spot because you have the title like a big net. You have Caprese, here it is. And you see there the same Guido, it's all stylized, etc. But there are some pavisiers, some knights, there are all these scenes on the cenotaph, so on the tomb where he's not closed because it was buried elsewhere, where you really see all these strongholds being captured by the Aretine forces, right? Rondine surrendered after a siege with 3 siege engines, apparently, and a Bastia, which was, again, this counter fortification was built during the sieges. This was beyond the Arno River. This place accepted a Cassero, which is yet another fortification within, built. There was also the sale of properties allowed for the departing inhabitants that were fearful of destruction and unwilling to endure prolonged blockade that would have led to starvation amid limited supplies. So here the Aretines smoothened the process as long as these guys were leaving. Guido aided rebellions in Urbino, Fermo, Fabriano, and Osimo. So these are all, again, in the Marches and close to Romagna. Again, all against papal authority there. Because in theory, that's, again, papal states, and there are papal representatives, but it's very difficult to control these places across the Apennines. And this prompts, again, the aforementioned excommunication by John the 22nd in 1324, right? And papal demands to restore Città di Castello, which naturally was an important commune in Umbria, strategically speaking. They're smaller in Umbria, but they matter a lot for connecting across the papal states. And so this was Guelph. And the Pope said, give it back to us. And Guido said, no, obviously. In all this, the Pope was confiscating Ubertini properties. There is the destruction of the castle at Montotto and Chitignano The Pope also nominally transfers the diocese of Arezzo to Cortona, that is close to Arezzo, so maintaining de facto a districtual continuity, but in basically under papal control in retaliation, right? This aimed to undermine, obviously, the warrior bishop temporal hold and isolate him ecclesiastically from the broader Ghibelline network that relied on shared religious legitimacy as well. Because again, these people were also very and deeply religious, but in that more Ghibelline and so sort of idea of secular, of temporal power, of the spiritual one of the church. At least those were the guys who had to be in charge in theory. And this thing lives along. I mean, it's part of the great investiture controversy and the broader struggle between church and empire in a metaphysical and ideological sense. But it's not like they didn't stick, obviously, to the foundations of Catholicism at all. The Tarlati regime, as you know, was actually faring pretty well. And it actually peaked during Ludwig of Bavaria's Italian expedition that we have described in different videos, in particular, again, in the one about Ludwig's biography. Interestingly enough, Guido Tarlati crowned the would-be emperor, so it was technically king of Germany, king of the Romans, as king of Italy in Milan. Guido goes over to Milan in spite of all the threats, etc., and together with all the Ghibelline leaders of Italy, interestingly enough. They made this surprise to Ludwig that would actually take also the Visconti as hostages, because it was mostly in Italy for the money and the title. It was pretty shrewd in that. But it's really important to see, do you realize this? Guido Tarlati crowned Ludwig of Wittelsbach king of Italy, which was the precondition for becoming Holy Roman Emperor. That was the crown. We could be a king of France, king of Germany, it didn't matter. But if you weren't king of Italy, you couldn't become Holy Roman Emperor. And it's the Tarlati that have the honor. We are in Milan in May 1327. All this despite papal interdict. Obviously, this is, again, under the Visconti as well, so that was a imperial vicariate, and there in Milan they were safe, obviously, but it's also interesting that Guido managed to cross central northern Italy without disturbances. In general, there were ways to do it, but it's still remarkable and how important he was considered in Italy. Probably there's some decision not to play too much the rivalry between Milan and Verona played a role in choosing the leader of Arezzo. There was also Castruccio, who would become best friends with Ludwig, but as we will see now, that's another story. Also, Guido accompanies Ludwig toward Tuscany and mediated at Ripafratta to allow the passage of the imperial army without entering Pisa. There was a Ghibelline city, but had understood that Ludwig would have sacked it had it entered the city, just out of the money, just like he had taken hostages the Visconti, to get to squeeze money, right? And in fact, all this mediation witnessed to the offer of 60,000 florins, which was the price of a city, not Pisa, admittedly, but Lucca was bought for such price at some point, for example. This drew ambassadors as well, such as Lemmo Guinizelli, Sismondi, Albizzo da Vico, and Ser Jacopo da Calci. Here there is all an interesting situation where the Aretines argue with the Luke case Guido tells to Castruccio that basically he had exploited too much the situation because Castruccio was the other great ally of Ludwig of Wittelsbach, not there is all an argument that fundamentally revolved around missed help, military aid, and other accusations. from the other side that the Aretines hadn't marched on Florence after Alto Pascio, that has occurred in 1325, by the way. Guido dies, however. The late 20s are the moment in which some of the greatest die. Sciarra Colonna, Can Grande della Scala, the Saint Castruccio later on. These were the great Ghibelline leaders of the era and incredible figures to begin with. Guido died at Montenero on October the 21st, 1327. He was an old man, a life well spent indeed. He repented, interestingly enough, on his deathbed for his anti-church sins, which surely, again, he hadn't taken lightly, evidently. And he received the sacraments amid illness contracted in Maremma. Pier Saccone succeeded as Lord and Imperial Vicar of Arezzo. The Tarlati maintained firmly control over the city. But it's from this point onward that things will actually slip towards the abyss, right? Because the Guelphs will actually start coming back after these imperial expeditions. Ludwig of Bavaria will come back to Germany without too many issues after getting his crown. And so Arezzo is alone again, in a way, in a pretty difficult time. So the Tarlati brothers maintained the dominion over Arezzo, Città di Castello, Borgo San Sepolcro, that had been conquered in 1329 after an 8-month siege led by Roberto di Maso da Pietramala. Remember, the Pietramala are a branch of the Tarlati, with 600 cavalry and 3,000 infantry, exploiting the betrayal at the Porta de Ladroni, destroying Guelph houses and the Celle Bridge, executing resistance leaders and restoring roads selectively while guasting Guelph routes to favor loyal areas and facilitate internal control through improved communications that strengthen supply lines. Right? This is a pretty vast seigneury, territorially speaking. Lots of communes, lots of also smaller ones naturally, lots of land in general, passes, castles all across. Parts of Massa Trabaria even was gotten by the Tarlati through some subdivisions brokered with the Visconti, for example, Montagna for Pratomagno and Alpe di Catenaia down to Bibbiena and Castiglione Fibocchi. Massa, Verona for Pieve of St. Stephen and the Tiber Valley, Cegliolo for areas between Lago di Chiana, the Lake of Chiana, and the Cortona Mountains, and Pian d'Arezzo and Valdambra for the plain. Right? These were territories that the Aretines had managed to basically put together with these later acquisitions. In all this, institutionally, there are some defensori, so-called defenders. These are titles of communal offices that essentially concentrated military decisions in the regime, in governance. They removed other officials that didn't comply, and they even had Inquisition powers to enforce loyalty amid growing external threats from Guelph coalitions that coordinated their efforts through shared intelligence and joint funding. In spite of this power, it's evident that something is moving, however, across the frontiers. In fact, the coalition of Florence, Perugia, Siena, and Orvieto steadily eroded Aretine power. In 1335, Perugia seized Borgo San Sepolcro and Città di Castello through betrayal, right? As it had been normal, as the same Ghibellines had seized them. In that case, Ribaldo da Montedoglio opening the gates. And this period opens to, because these are essentially Umbrian cities that Perugia manages to capture, right? Or at least to install some Guelph allies in. And so Perugia is not a small power, launches devastating campaigns in 1335, 1336, including major defeats of Aretine forces near Castiglione Aretino. There is in June a victory with 1054 enemy killed, 300 captured, including Cecchino di Vinciolo and Pietro d'Andreuccio Bonanno Andreoni, 24 flags taken, and German knights knighted on the field. So this is actually a bloodbath of Guelphs that the Aretines managed to carry out, and these German knights are also distinguishing themselves, and there is all, again, that level of chivalry, of Ghibelline. Here, lots of German mercenaries are being hired continuously by the Italians, right? This is really a pattern that opens to the age of the soldiers of fortune and the free companies and so on. I've made some videos about this. There is a beautiful Aretine counterattack documented in at least an edition to, I think it is the second series of the Rerum Italicanum Scriptores, in the edition of the Annales Aretini, which is a letter sent by an unknown commander on the field to Pier Saccone. And so basically this is an Aretine vanguard that arrives up to the suburbs of Perugia, but is basically in devastating an enormous amount of territories. It's a beautiful letter. At some point we can't even read it today. We don't have time for it, but it documents the devastation of an incredibly large amount of villages that here they had no, like we wouldn't hear of them otherwise, but it's one of the few sources of this kind, because before this time you don't have like a letter of a commander from the field that tells you we devastated all of this. I will read the list. Tuoro, Battivalle, Lignale, Sanguineto, Mandrelle, Castello Nuovo, Borgonovo, Gonfigna, Vernazzino, Sant'Agata, Orsolini, Cernia, Montegè. These are all villages, right? Think about the people living in them. Passignano, Monteruffiano, Torricella, Montecolegno, Montefontisgiano, Monachia, Fontana, Cerciano, Lancaiello, San Lificiano, San Filiciano, Ponte di Valle, Sancto Fatucchio, Monte Alieri, Panicaiola, Vaiola, Paterno, and other borghi, right? Villages, borgis, etc. But please send us bread, right? They were asking for bread because we are exhausted. We don't have the supplies, right? We pushed so far, and there are some instances in which, the German knights, he said, like, under my command, wanted to exterminate this Borgo while we seized it, and we, kept them outside, while we were dealing with the people inside. It tells you, like, these bloodthirsty Germans that wanted to exterminate everybody. It was, like, connaturated with, let's be honest, like, the German mercenaries at this point were really quite some interesting anthropological figures. You told them to raise everything to the ground. You pointed the place, and they did that, right? This kind of, they were simple people. They knew what their hires wanted. But this is beautiful because it's literally the words. It's literally like somebody at some point transcribed this paper that was written from the field, and we have it from those very days. It's beautiful. This was a systematic razzia, it's raid in Italian, that stripped the countryside of Perugia of resources and population while disrupting, obviously, the harvest cycles. However, there is a further Perugian push that will not stop. The Perugians under Neri della Faggiola at this time, interestingly enough, Marquis of Valliana, Branca Golfucci, and the Ubaldini sons took Città di Castello in October with 500 German cavalry. So they basically turned against the Tarlati. This is a complex political mechanism. Essentially, they had overexpanded, and now these guys were simply paid by the Perugians to sort of change side. So much so that Rodolfo Tarlati is captured after the surrender of his Rocca, lacking provisions to resist, and the winners subject him to mockery with garlands of fish in a humiliating display intended to break morale and deter further resistance from the remaining Tarlati loyalists. Because, as we've seen, by the way, these Tarlati were now thinking to be the shiny ones, right? To have the Imperium, to be the actual lords of heavenly glory. But after Guido's death, things had gradually deteriorated. By March 1337, Pier Saccone and Tarlato negotiated under different relentless pressure coming from all sides, surrendered to Florence because the Perugians couldn't quite take over Arezzo. Florence was very close. And so they decided that, naturally making it very simple, that history is much more complicated. But in all of this, Perugia was not acting alone. Obviously, the Florentines were behind all this. And so Arezzo decided, okay, let's sort of surrender to the civilized side. And it passed under Florentine domination. However, in exchange for 40,000 florins, 25,000 for the city, 14,000 for the vice comitatus from the Conti Guidi, that were yet another very prestigious family of essentially Florentine rural aristocracy, but they had been also installed in the Aretinian countryside because, again, complicated story, but that's how normally rural dynasts had been present there. The Aretines had been bullying them to an extent as well. In fact, the Florentines were trying to take those territories back against money. So it was all a negotiated agreement with Florence. It wasn't simply, okay, the Florentines came to dictate rule, but they gradually would. Florence tended essentially to absorb cities through these financial deals as opposed to conquest. That's why they thought, oh my God, we're so high and mighty. We're not like the Milanese that conquer everybody. But it still, of course, was some sort of blackmail, and the elites here tried to secure their position there. There's a lot of cooptation. In fact, the Tarlati acquire the Florentine citizenship rights. The Tarlati also retained some comitatus castles. This was completely normal in how sort of the communal countryside was organized. And in this initial deal, there is a popular acclaim for peace, because war had been grinding really Arezzo step by step. The Perugians had been creeping in, and so when this peace agreement is delivered, like there are cries in Arezzo, things like "Long live Florence," even with olive branches, as Florentine troops entered the city and assumed control of the gates and fortifications to actually prevent immediate revolt, which could always break out, because not all Aretines were happy with this, obviously. But it's what we were saying before, for how, of course, like the medieval city mindset is very universal. Like the Aretines really feel deeply to be Aretines, the Florentines are somebody else. They're actually kind of the same people. Right, they speak your same language. They're literally, there is no difference in any meaningful ethno-linguistic sense, and so that's how Arezzo received a Florentine podestà, that was Corrado Panciatichi in particular, and garrisoned castles at Poggio San Donato and Porta del Piano. The Ghibellines were gradually marginalized through expulsions and confinements that dismantled residual opposition and reoriented civic institutions toward Guelph loyalty enforced by Florentine oversight and periodic inspections. You can argue that the Tarlati had been monopolizing the picture, as we've seen, for a long time, so there wasn't much of a further sort of Ghibelline force, like, for example, a more scattered one, at least, like as we've seen at the beginning of the century. Right here, we're 40 years later, and things have changed, and the pre-Black Death vibes here are very strong everywhere there is a crisis. It's not like the Aretines give up in absolute terms. For example, brief reversals occurred under Gauthier de Brienne, that was the Duke of Athens, the Lord of Florence between 1342 and 1343, and so actually Lord of Arezzo as a consequence. The Florentine army had been crushed at the gates of Lucca by the Pisans, and so there is this moment of instability. I made videos about the crisis of Florentine republicanism recently that talks about all the various institutional developments. There were uprisings in Florence. The small people managed to rise even to government at a point, so it was a mess. And Gauthier de Brienne actually was favoring a bit everyone. He was all over the place. That's why also he was expelled later. But he favored, for example, the same Tarlati among others. After having actually arrested Piero Saccone in November 1341, but also released him upon assuming power in September 1342 and granting limited restitutions because the Tarlati had tried after the Florentine defeat to rise again. And so you see, they had been the ones who had brokered a pact with Florence, but also had maintained some privilege. This is a short-lived thing because Gauthier de Brienne is expelled from Florence for good. We're in July 1343. And this actually triggers a Guelph uprising in Arezzo, interestingly enough. So, of course, there were Guelphs, and so it's very complicated step by step to say, but who were these people? I mean, were the same people that had been supporting Tarlati before, or had they changed idea? Like, how did it really work? Obviously, it's complicated, but now there were people who said, okay, we are within the orbit of Florence. Warfare is becoming bigger and scarier in Italy. We need protection. We can't go out there on our own like the Aretines. So there is an ever more confederal mentality with Florence. In any case, during these incidents, the Aretine citizens destroyed the Cassero and expelled the remaining Ghibellines amid tumults and destruction of the same Tarlati symbols that marked a decisive break with the old regime and signaled the end of significant Ghibelline military autonomy within the city walls. Although the Tarlati retained, this is painful, right? Because as we've seen, the Tarlati had reached, again, a very high point, right, in Ghibelline history. And Arezzo had been the center of that, so there should have been a municipal pride, right? But at the time, with Florence around, with probably also some ideology of exhaustion that favored the Guelphs and the popular classes and so on. Think about the Verde the Greens that we discussed before. Well, there wasn't much of a rigidity, a stiffness like in the resistance against Florence anymore. And so, although the Tarlati retained pockets, such as Castiglione Aretino until 1345, with the capitulation to Perugia after a 2-year siege, right, carried out by Perugians with multiple battifolli, so in these castles built around as a wall against the fortress, including this, we know the names: Molino, which means mill, of Castelluccio, Molino del Vento, Battifolle della Cannella, della Fornace, Piccolino. These are smaller ones. Piccolino, in fact, means very small, like a little one. Palisades, ditches, and from Italian art at the time, think about Guido Ricci's fresco in Siena. These are the same exact years, so like you have an idea of what these things look like, right? And also names reflecting Perugian propaganda, by the way, that mocked the defenders and underscore the prolonged nature of the investment that exhausted local resources and forced surrender on terms that favored the victors. Also showing that Perugia had not stopped to aggress territories that belonged to a dependency of Florence now, even though probably the thing had been accepted from the other side as well. The Tarlati regional power collapsed. Right. Arezzo, now firmly aligned with the Guelph bloc and under Florentine tutelage, ceased to function, as many Italian communes under the rule of the bigger ones, as an independent actor, in this case especially as an independent Ghibelline actor, by the late 1340s, which overlapped with the great crisis of the Middle Ages. And so Aretine military history reduced to local skirmishes, dependence on larger Tuscan powers, and occasional internal factional violence amid the broader stabilization following the Tarlati eclipse and the demographic shocks of the mid-century that further weakened any residual capacity for autonomous action and shifted the city toward, again, a subordinate role within the expanding Florentine domain. And again, the Florentines beaten by everybody, but they keep expanding anyway. That's how resources they were. A dynamic that redefined Arezzo's strategic position in regional clashes for the remainder of the Trecento as Florence consolidated its hegemony over former rivals. And so this is actually sad, but I think it's pretty explicit and sort of exemplificative of what was happening to the Italian communes in terms of absorption into the bigger cities' spheres, right? You can't here see, it's just basically a couple of generations we recounted, but they are dense, and there is an important change. Like people here, I don't know, somebody born in, say, 1270 could have been, old enough to have fought at Campaldino and passed through these other clashes in his maturity and being still alive by the end of the period. Maybe the plague killed him in the end as an old man. This is what happened to Villani, for example. That is the perfect demographic sample. Let's say it wasn't the only one as a chronicler, but in a sense, these are the men of that specific great rise and fall of medieval civilization. And so it's an incredibly educational topic to browse. We have talked very often about not the generics, but sort of the broader theory of these rises and falls. We're talking about the various the communes as such, and saying this is normally what happens to them. But then looking at the history of the individual ones is truly the only way to show you how it really happened, right? And to explain how this mechanism worked. I think it's incredibly precious, and we should be extremely thankful of this enormous amount of knowledge. I really care about covering European history with the same degree of depth everywhere, and so I invented this it's not really a new series, but it's like a bit the equivalent of the original one, but through a military lens, right? Or a provincial, a smaller one, because I actually made a series, it's almost finished, for the entire Eurasia about the regional, sort of military regional outlook. So, and passing to this depth, I think, is quite relevant. Also because most of these histories are about war, if you realize it. If you read, for example, these Italian chronicles of the era, they're really talking about war most of the time. There isn't much space for else. Yes, there are the constructions, the city, etc. But for them, the greatest thing, the thing that mattered the most was, proving themselves in war, right? And I'm surely going to make a video about Guido Tarlati as well, Tarlati di Pietramala, because he's, again, together with very specific leaders. I have a spoiler. Well, I can't say it. It's Azzone Visconti, right, that participated also to Alto Pascio, etc. I prepared a video about that, so we will be looking at him also for our biographies. Again, it never ends. You always have these incredibly interesting characters. I have something about Germany. I can't say which. I'm going to expand on sort of very specific grounds, but I'm really glad to make this long videos, because that's what really medieval history deserves. And this, just imagine, this is just like a little part of the story. If you were to research everything, it would be like you could write entire books about this all, like a video book. Imagine that, right? So you have also the equivalent of this if you're interested as a whole, and you see that this is all a coherent narrative. There isn't something that escapes the broader picture, the logic, etc. Like, you can really understand history through this stuff in a way like probably never experienced before. Now that I look at it, about Tuscany, as I was saying in the beginning, really made mostly videos on Florence. We have a 35, this is the 36th video. This is, I think, about Tuscany in general, but there is also modern stuff, right? This is the 32nd in any case for the Middle Ages, and wow, it's actually more than because there was the series about Dante, there was some town, and the series about Florence that dominated. Yeah, there is no doubt. Well, this is the reason why we must really talk about our cities. I just covered Siena and Pisa, which is already something. But I mean, again, look Arezzo itself, because we haven't talked about the broader history throughout the entire Middle Ages, which we do in this series. So I'm very glad to have inserted this because it really speaks of yet another player that is often underrated. And at some point, we'll also make the video about the Battle of Campaldino. It is the high point, albeit a defeat of Aretinian warfare. It's extremely interesting from the sources. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.